Welcome and thank you for attending today's presentation on required distributions for defined benefit plans. The subject matter, the outline of this presentation, is this webpage. A basic understanding of required distributions for defined contribution plans and IRA is a prerequisite. This presentation is brought to you by Pension Resource, a joint board of enrolled actuaries approved qualifying sponsor for continuing education. For your instructor, I am Devin Smelzer, enrolled actuary. For your CE credit, time is automatically tracked by the video platform. Please do not skip ahead or pause more than a few minutes, otherwise you will need to reload the page and try again. After completing the required minutes, you'll be able to submit for a CE certificate. During this presentation, we'll be primarily covering the code, regulations, and examples. Other related resources like required plan document language, private letter rulings, court cases, government forms, and correction procedures are included on this webpage for reference outside the presentation. Please note, while that an effort was made by me to be materially accurate, I may have misinterpreted guidance incorrectly, but this is why I include references to the guidance for you to confirm your own opinion and application. When in doubt, give deference to the latest published guidance. If you spot something incorrect during this presentation or just want to provide additional comments, please feel free to contact me. With additional information, I may update this recording. As we begin working through this presentation, at the top we have some few web page options showing or hiding the content. By default, content is collapsed in tree views, so you can choose to expand only the content that's relevant to what you're looking at. You can click Expand All to see the content of all sections if you want to do a mass print. We will focus on required distributions for living participants. It is less common to deal with post-death required distributions on non-spouse beneficiaries with annuity benefit payments. As such, that content will mostly be skipped for our webcast today. Internal Revenue Code 4189 says that a qualified retirement plan must pay required distributions to participants to keep its tax favored status and avoid participant excise taxes for not receiving timely distributions. These required distributions are generally taxable to the participants and not eligible for rollover. Before we review the code, let's look at these cheat sheets. For retired participants and 5% owner employees, they are required to start taking distributions by April 1st of the calendar year after they turn the applicable age. Note there's a gap between age 63 and 64, but we'll cover that later. This chart can help you identify the required begin date. This key points table is a summary of some of the talking points I'll be covering during this presentation. After watching this recording, consider reviewing this table to help commit these general contents to memory. Let's move on to the plan document language guidance. It is required that plan documents include language for required distributions. The general language is published by the IRS in their list of required modification. This handout has the required distributions from the DBLRM and pasted here in tree view for reference. The IRS updates the LRMs with each document cycle, and this one's from the latest DB cycle. Because all plan documents contain slightly different language and structure for how it is organized, and each plan you work on has similar language in it, I'm going to skip here to focus on better resources. When you are processing a required distribution, the default guidance should be that plan documents language for processing required distributions. So consider your plan document and also consider recent law changes that might not be reflected in your plan document. When a plan document language is hard to read, it is helpful to compare it to similar language of the LRM to see a slightly different worded version for clarity. Here's the link to the IRS's website for the LRMs. DB and DC plans have different LRMs in PDF format. The core of what you should follow is what's written in your plan document, but let's face it, that is why we are here. What does the plan document really mean for required distributions? And for that, we need to start with the Internal Revenue Code. Here is Internal Revenue Code 4189. Let's review it in detail. 4089 Cap A says retirement plan isn't qualified unless it pays the entire interest to the employee no later than the required begin date, or pay their interest over the life of that employee and their beneficiary as required by the regulation. Now, what does that mean? A plan either needs to pay out all their benefits before the required begin date or start paying their benefits with the intent to fully distribute their benefits over the life expectancy of that individual. Sounds simple enough. Either get the money out of the plan or follow some lifetime payment rules. Next, 401A9 Cap B covers if they die before their interest is fully paid. We have four possibilities. I, where the distributions have already begun. Double I, where the payments have not begun. Triple I is where a beneficiary can be used over the life expectancy for the calculations. And we have some special rules for the surviving spouse. Because we want to stay focused on this webcast while the participant is live, we're going to skip these. Cap C defines when a participant must begin their required distributions, and that's April 1st following the calendar year in which they turn applicable age, or April 1st after the year they retire if they're not a 5% owner. A 5% owner includes Internal Revenue Code 318 constructive ownership of stock through family, trust, and partnerships, etc. Because governmental employers and churches don't have owners, there are no 5% owners for those employers. Regardless, we have an exception written in the code for those individuals, or those plan types. If a participant is not a 5% owner, is retired over the age of 70 and a half, and decides not to take their distributions, then their benefits must be actually increased. Most pension plans include late actual adjustments for anyone past the retirement age, so it's kind of a moot point. However, the key point here is you can't suspend these employees' benefits to suppress late actual adjustments. If they are still employed or a 5% owner, you potentially can. Note that this late actual adjustment requirement doesn't apply to governmental or church plans. While you're here, you might be asking, well, what does it mean to retire? We've mentioned that a couple times above. The definition of retire, you actually have to do some hunting to try to find where this is defined. The best that I've located is Private Letter Ruling 2011-47033, hyperlinked here. It cites various sources for that definition, including court cases and other code sections to make sense of what it means to retire. While it is based on facts and circumstances, it is generally when a person separates from employment with the anticipation that they will not return to employment. Termination of employment and retirement are generally treated as the same. If an employer gives a termination notice to an employee, but they keep rehiring them every single year, are they really terminated? Or is an employee being paid but not actually working to make it look like they are not retired? Consider advising your plan sponsors that the IRS may see through who is actually retired or terminated and is required to take or not take distributions. Now we are down to the applicable ages for when a person becomes RMD age. We are currently within anyone turning 73 in a calendar year, and that's going to apply from 2023 through 2033 calendar years. Those individuals are required to start taking distributions. That is, again, April 1st after the year they turn applicable age or retire if not a 5% owner. Cap D tells us when we're calculating life expectancies, we do it annually generally. Cap E provides definitions to designated beneficiaries. Since very few defined benefit plans offer annuities to surviving non-spousal beneficiaries, I'm going to skip. Cap F and G, I'm also going to skip. You can review these later if needed. I'm also going to skip Cap H, but point out that the 10-year rule for paying out deceased participants doesn't apply to DB plans. Also skipping Cap J. All right. Let's quickly review the requirements of 401A9. It says their entire interest must be paid. What is that? Well, that's all their benefits in the plan, either it be annuities from a DB plan or account balances, etc. Those must either be distributed from the plan or paid out over the life expectancies. To understand this, we need to go to the regulations. In this context, regulations are published by the Treasury, the IRS, to help explain code Congress passed. When reviewing regulations and code together, it is often helpful to keep in mind which was last updated. We are fortunate in that both the code and the regulations have been recently updated. There are 10 regulations for us to consider for required distributions. There is a table of contents regulation, a general reg, during one's lifetime, death before the begin date, determination of the beneficiaries, distributions from DC plans, distribution of DB plans, rollover special rules, and lastly, life expectancy table regulations. Since we're keeping focus on RMDs for pension plans of living participants, we're going to skip a few of these regulations. Let's review -1 regulations for the in general. Paragraph A tells us that qualified retirement plans are not exactly the same as IRAs. IRAs, you can combine their total value and take a distribution out of one, whereas each qualified retirement plan must pay a minimum distribution if there are benefits in it for that participant. Paragraph B and D have some effective dates, but since we are past these, I'm going to skip. Paragraph C points out if there are options that a plan document can utilize for required distributions. Now, let's go on to -2 regulation. This gives us the basics. A1 either says pay out all their interest, their account balance, or accrued benefits before their begin date, or at least pay annuity over their life expectancy. A2 says it is a calendar year, not plan years, to calculate these benefits, or should I say calculate or consider for the required begin date. It also says by default, defined benefit plans are to pay annuities or their default form of payment. We'll get to that more later in the examples. A3 is for distributions commencement before the begin dates. Paragraph I says that, I says distributions that begin before the required begin date need not to comply with 4189. However, once they are past the required begin date, then these restrictions apply. So if they've begun an annuity in a form of payment at age 70, and this form of payment continues until the required distribution dates, there might be an issue if that form of payment didn't comply with 4189 minimum required distribution regulations. Paragraph I says you generally don't get credit for taking distributions before your begin date. You start applying and checking to see if 4189 is compliant with their required begin dates. There's a little exception to that. When you're taking your first single lump sum distribution, you consider the year you turn the applicable age and also the required begin date. But again, we're going to cover that in examples, and that is the DC distribution rules. III says if you're forcing everyone to take the required distributions, then you can count that as their required begin dates, even if they're not retired, for those who are non-5% owners. A4 is for distributions after death. Here in paragraph B, we can see the IRS is trying to make it best to be clear on the required begin dates. And with that, there's that chart here at the very top of the web page is what is based on for the required applicable ages and the required begin dates. Notice that they have a reserve block in here for those born after January 1st, 1959 and before January 1st, 1960. There's a hole in the code that defines what their applicable ages are for those individuals. Congress has some time to figure that out, but until then, I'm just going to be safe and assume age 73 applies to those individuals for required distributions. I suspect the IRS will Congress will modify the code to fill in that gap sometime between now and 2033. Paragraph B3 defines who is a 5% owner and must take their required distributions even if they are still working. It uses the same definition as top-heavy and is determined when they hit their applicable age. In future years, if they are no longer a 5% owner, they still must take required distributions because it's set in stone as of their applicable age. If you happen to work with a governmental, church, or multiple employer plans, paragraph B4 and B5 has notes for you. This is the end of -2 reg. I'm going to circle back to -4 regulation after reviewing -6 for DB plans. Regulation -6, how to do DB required distributions. In paragraph A1, we have to either pay out their entire interest or pay out the annuity that doesn't exceed the life of an employee. And if in a form of payment that considers beneficiary, that beneficiary to be included. Payment intervals must not exceed 1 year, so monthly, quarterly, and annual payments would work if permitted by your plan. these payments are to be uniformly spread. So if you start annual payments April 1st, then generally continue those payments April 1st each year. If you start monthly, then those payments continue monthly. A2 says the form of annuity payments can be in a single life annuity, joint survivor, with or without a period certain or a certain only calculation. When certain only periods are used, they can exceed the life expectancy of the participants, and if a beneficiary is included, considering their life expectancy too. A3, within our context, generally just reinforces the above, but does add a detail regarding the first distribution year. All benefit accruals as of the first distribution year must be included. To confirm what this technically is their first distribution year, we have to backpedal a bit to find out technically what that is. And in -2, it says the first distribution year is defined at -5. And to save us time, I created a popover of where this is defined. The first distribution year is the calendar year that they turn their applicable age. It's not the year of the April 1st. April 1st is the required begin date following the first distribution year. So we have an example here to bring this into perspective. It is a participant as at the end of their first distribution year. They have a monthly accrued benefit of $500. Thus, the required distribution to commence by April 1st or before is going to be his $500 per month benefit. And since this is starting April 1st, payment there being sent out, this will be 9 months of $500. Then the following year is going to be 12 months of $500 and so on in this scenario, the simple scenario of no additional accruals. Paragraph A4 is an alternative to paying the participant as a life annuity. It is to pay out their entire benefit as a single lump sum. We have two choices, II and III, for how to get the single lump sum calculation for the portion of that is not eligible for rollover. Let me back up a second here. So for the annuity payments paid out of the pension plan, annuity payments generally are not eligible for rollover. So if you commence your annuity, then those payments are not eligible for rollover. They get paid out of the plan. But when you're taking a single lump sum, it's more than the amounts needed. So there's going to be a portion. Most of it's not going to be restricted, so it can be rolled over. There's going to be a smaller portion of it that needs to be taxed, not eligible for rollover. So here in II, it says we get to treat their DB benefit from the DC like a DC plan by calculating the account balance and dividing using a uniform life table to determine how much is not eligible for rollover. And there is a catch with this method, and you've probably seen it with your DC distributions, in that if you're calculating the single lump sum payout as of during the year of April 1st, so during their second distribution year, there's two amounts that need to be calculated not eligible for rollover. They're both using the December year ends account balance, the accrued benefits in this situation. So you're calculating the present value as a distribution date, but you're going to take your PVAB and you're going to divide it by their applicable age factors for the two amounts. Their first distribution year and their second distribution year are not going to be eligible for rollover. This is just like DC plans. So you get their present value of accrued benefit, and if it's 470 applies, you include that amount, look up their applicable age for the first distribution year, go to the uniform life table, find that factor, divide by the single lump sum by that amount for year one, and then find their age for their second distribution year, find that factor, divide their single lump sum payout by that amount, and then add those two amounts. Those two amounts are not eligible for rollover under II. III isn't too different in that it's taking 2 years, your first distribution year and your second distribution year, of hypothetical annuity payments that are not eligible for rollover. So for your first distribution year, you're going to assume there's the beginning of the calendar year, there was a monthly annuity being paid, multiply that by 12, and do it again for your second distribution year. So in other words, for most cases, you're going to take the end of year benefits for your first distribution year, the calendar year they're in, multiply that by 24 for their annuity monthly payments that would have been paid out if they would have taken annuity payments for the entire years. And that amount would not be eligible for rollover. The rest of the single sum value above those amounts would be eligible. Again, you can use II or III for calculating amounts eligible, not eligible for rollover. The lesser of the two, that works too. Let me reiterate a point here that's kind of subtle. If you're taking a single lump sum distribution, in the year that they turn their applicable age, you still have an amount not eligible for rollover, just like in DC plans. If you do not want to have a required distribution paid from a DB plan for a participant that took a single lump sum, then they would need to do that the year before they turn their applicable age. So the year they turn 72, for example, before the year their applicable age is 73, then you can have a single lump sum paid out without considering the required distribution. But as soon as they turn the year of their applicable age, and they take a lump sum, you're going to calculate that amount, a amount not eligible for rollover. Let me circle back to the annuity form of payments for our required distributions here. Those do not have a 2-year or 1-year full year requirement like the single lump sum values there. Here, your entire interest is commencing your annuity from the plan. And since annuity payments are generally not eligible for rollover, then you're already being taxed on the money amount, and therefore you're simply in conforming with 401(a)(9). So take this to a little further example. If you retire, say at 65, well before your required begin date, you're receiving annuity payments. These are not eligible for rollover. And if you took your form of payments in single life or joint survivor, then you're already in conformance with 401(a)(9). So as you become at your required begin date, it's kind of an afterthought that you're already in compliance with 401(a)(9, not really need to worry about it. If there's more accruals, then we'll talk about that shortly. Let me jump down to paragraphs E and F for additional accruals. Paragraph E says, besides their first distribution year, when you include all their accruals for that year, for the years following that, then you add the accrual following the year of the accrual for the required distribution for your payment intervals. And paragraph F says to treat increases in vesting like additional accruals. And this is different from DC plans in that if you have an unvested portion of balance, you might have to pay that in the following year. Not covering DC work here, just shouting out there is a little caveat on DC distribution for non-vested amounts that doesn't apply to DB plans. We treat that like additional accruals. For the first distribution year, when they turn their applicable age, if they're not vested, then there is no amount to be paid on the required begin date. The following years, you get a look back for what benefit payment needs to be paid this year. It's just that first distribution year gets a special distribution treatment by April 1st. That once you pass April 1st, then provided your payments are annual for that date, then that date's gone in the past, no matters anymore. Now it matters your intervals for your payments. So depending on your payment intervals, monthly or annual are the common ones, then this really doesn't give too much time to adjust for the new accruals of the prior year to reflect in your current year payments. For example, if you're doing April 1st annual payments, well, then you have to calculate the benefit payments by April 1st to have them increase. But now look at monthly accruals. So if you were taking a monthly payments and you accrue a benefit in December, then January's payment, the monthly payment just like a couple days later, should reflect that additional accrual or vesting increase. That is administratively impossible. Thankfully, there is administrative delay provision for new accruals and vesting increases to get caught up. If last year the vesting benefit increased, then you have the entire calendar year of your distribution year to get it squared up. This is an administrative delay clause only applies to the new accrual. Their existing required distribution annuity amounts should be paid at their regular intervals. So like for those employers that are using brokerage accounts to administer their defined benefit plans, I'm a big fan of auto bill pay, specifically for getting their RMD payments done. So you give them this year's required distribution amount and say your future payments will be no less than this. Set up your payment frequency and have your bill pay that out. And every year you come back to them and give them a true up. So let's say June, you finally get all the work from them, the census data, you recalculate what their new accruals are, vesting increases, and you give them that amount. So you say, okay, we got to catch up for 5 or 6 months to be paid up, include late actual adjustments for interest, if your plan includes that provision there. And then any future payments for that calendar year, the total of those amounts would meet the required distribution for that calendar year. So it makes it pretty convenient. So after your first distribution year, you look at your calendar years for the total monthly amount to be paid out, monthly or annual, but your total accrued benefit for the prior year is how much times 12 that you need to pay out for the current year. So you got the whole year to get that squared away. All right, now down to a different topic, but it's related to everything we're just talking about here. It is A6. Now, it says you have separately identifiable components that are subject to different attribution forms. Then 41A9 is applied separately to those, can be applied separately to those components. Now that plan documents commonly have bifurcated benefit options, the option to split distributions between lump sum and annuity payments, or to take in a portion of the benefits, I see this provision allowing both single lump sum and annuity payment methods to be used in the same distribution year. One could counter-argue with, well, this was targeted for traditional DB plans that were converted into cash balance plans, so you clearly got two separately identifiable components, one a traditional benefit, one a cash balance benefit, one subject to 47E3, the other one's not. But I counter that with, well, if this reg intended to be that specific, it would have been. It says separately identifiable components. So if you can separately identify accrued benefits under the plan, then that accrual, and if your plan allows that to have a different distribution election form to be applied to it, then I see this applies. So you can use that for splitting out the distribution elections in the same calendar year for what methods are being used. And further, I don't see the election form. So when you take the required distribution form payment election, say it's annuity form payments, you lock that form payment generally. We'll get to more details on that later. But you lock that form payment in for that election of that future payment stream for those annuities. But the new accruals, I don't see that as roping in those payments either. So for example, let's say you have a person who is age 74, past their applicable age. They took a single lump sum benefit of all their benefits in the plan. The following year, they accrue more benefits, and now they are 75. I don't see as any requirement that forces them to take a single lump sum again, age 75. As a regulatory compliance, if you happen to find something, please send it in, and I'll update this presentation, but I'm not aware of any guidance that ropes it in. Administration-wise, yes, it is a lot more convenient to have the same form of payment apply. For example, the person is taking $500 a month monthly payments, they accrue another $100, and it just automatically rolls into $600 of payments, so you don't have to go back and do new election forms. Take a look at your plan documents, your election forms, add or remove additional appropriate language. If you need to speak with an attorney, go ahead to help service their plan types, because each plan type is administratively helpful or not for how that work is done. For example, owner-only plans probably want separate elections. Larger plans probably do not want separate elections done. So making sure your plan document it has language in there that allows or constricts, conform with your plan document. If it doesn't describe that, of what you can and can't do, is often an administratively interpretation clause in the plan documents. Once you establish a procedure, it must be consistent, non-discriminatory. But you can go ahead and roll with that, reasonable interpretations. Speaking of interpretations, A7 says the commissioner may provide more guidance, and maybe someday we'll get guidance on these topics. For example, new accruals being forced to follow the existing elections, or timing adjustments on payments. But until then, use reasonable interpretations, because the whole point of 41A9 is that money needs to get out of the tax sheltered environment and be taxed. And so if you're trying to do interpretations that kind of bypass the whole point of 41A9, you're going to run afoul. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in excise taxes, about what is a reasonable interpretation. But until we get guidance from the commissioner, taking the light of the overall intent of 41A9 is that taxes are to be paid on a certain amount of benefits someday to be worked in a certain time. So figure that in for your administrative operations, document that, and proceed with your plans. Paragraph B, incidental benefits of required distributions. If your participant is taking a life annuity for their retirement benefit, then all is good. There's nothing to worry about here. But remember back with the code, it talked about when the payments were over the life of the participant, it also included the complexities of when there's a beneficiary involved. But what do you do when you have a participant and beneficiary needing payments because their form of payment considers they're both? because it says it must be over their lives, both of them, or more that might be involved. Most DB plans do not allow non-spousal beneficiaries to be designated for annuity benefit payments. Thus, I'm just going to skip B2III because it's just not a common thing to there. There's a lot of complexities included in this section about how to calculate it when you have a child of the participant and the years. You got to factor it in there. No, I'm not going into that because that's such a nuanced detail. Note that it's common upon death that you'll have more benefits being paid out as a single lump sum to the beneficiaries, but this is not an annuity payment. This is a single lump sum value. Therefore, it would fall under the 5-year distribution rule that I didn't cover earlier because it's after the participant's death. You can go back and there read those code sections for more details. But yes, death benefits would be under the 5-year rule, but annuity payments are not under that 5-year rule. They have the incidental benefit rules here. But now let's go back to a common scenario where you have a participant and their beneficiary is their spouse. B2II says if the employee's sole beneficiary is the employee's spouse, then any distribution of form of payment that satisfies 401(a)(9 without regard to these additional requirements are deemed to satisfy a 409(9) reg. So, for example, if you're taking a joint and survivor form of payment, you're fine. But your certain form of payment, you're fine there because you have a spouse and the participant form of payments. Things just get tricky when you have non-spousal beneficiaries, but again, not covering those because plans aren't required to provide joint survivor benefits to non-spousals. Plans are required to provide QIPSA benefits to spouses, qualified pre-retirement survivor annuities. So those are kind of already in the required form of payments. That's why it's in the 401(a) regs to say, hey, yeah, you get a free pass on 401(a)(9 required distributions there. Yeah, the law doesn't require non-spousal beneficiaries to receive annuity payments. That would be above and beyond for plan designs. All right, now down to paragraph C. It says that you can include annuity certain forms of payment. So for the maximum life length of a certain period, you go to the life expectancy chart for when you are calculating the maximum length for a life expectancy year certain limitation. If the spouse is 10 years younger, you must use a separate table for using life expectancies. While we are looking at the certain annuities, let me jump down to K3, where it says if you start taking distributions early and you're using a certain only form of payments, each year early that you get to add 1 year to your certain length and period. So for example, if your applicable age was 73, but you started your certain payments at age 72, anticipation that you're going to flow right into 401(a)(9 regs, you get to add 1 to that. So if there's a 26 life expectancy, 26 years, well, then if you start 1 year early, then it's 27. All right. Another little detail is that for your certain form of payments, you do not go back and recalculate their life expectancy for later years for your length of certain periods. Those things, once established, those things are locked in stone for their benefit commencement for their certain periods. All right, skipping paragraph D, this large section here for annuity contracts, because those aren't common for most actuaries. Now down to paragraph G and H for late actual adjustments. For non-5% owners that haven't commenced benefits by 70.5, they must receive late actual adjustments even before the required begin dates. So in other words, here we have a late actual adjustments required begin date for non-5% owners, and it is actually in here defined as April 1st as a calendar year after they turn 70.5. These cease to be required once they commence benefits. They reemphasize a point in here that even if a plan allows a suspension of benefits, and notice that will stop late actual adjustments, this does not work for non-5% owners. You have to have them in there. Note that H1III takes into account the definition of late actual adjustments, takes into account distributions for the late actual adjustments. This is rather interesting line since these late actual adjustments stop when benefits commence. So you have a distribution line in here that says you got to factor distributions with your late actual adjustments. So I'm trying to read between the lines here, and I see an argument that you are adjusting for distributions that do not comply with 401(a)(9) actual requirements for rolling this forward to the new year. Or say if you take another scenario that I see it applying is you bifurcate your benefits, you split them in half, and so you're taking a single lump sum of 50% of your benefits, and then you can factor it in there. So those are the two scenarios I foresee that where this sentence here makes sense for factoring in late actual adjustments and considering to apply them because their benefits haven't commenced yet. So those kind of make sense. Okay. Paragraph K has some technical details. One says when terminated life expectancy is used their age as their benefit starts. We hinted that earlier. You do not redetermine their life expectancy later on. So in other words, if you start their retirement early, say 70 or 65, you calculate life expectancy there. You don't go back at the required begin date and recalculate the required distribution amounts. Once you commence your benefits, you're just look ahead and take into consideration, will this form of payment comply? Yes, it will. Hooray. Then do the calculations as of the distribution date. Now to paragraph J for 436 restrictions. If a plan is poorly funded, it might not be able to pay the full benefits due to 436 restrictions. This doesn't mean, the 436 restrictions, that a participant can't elect an accelerated form of payment like a lump sum. It just means that the plan itself can't fully pay out until the restrictions are lifted. This doesn't run afoul with 401(a)(9) required distributions. See J2 and J3 for special rules if subject to 436 accelerated distributions. But in general, the 436 allows you to pay single life amounts of their elected portion for their RMD requirements or the not eligible for rollover amounts. So this specific section here in the reg says you don't have a qualification issue if you have a 436 restriction, making it more difficult to pay out plan benefits until those restrictions are lifted. While we're talking about 436, we might as well as mention regarding Regulation 1.418-5B for pre-termination restrictions for the high 25 restricted HCEs, where the plan would be less than 100% funded if the HCE was paid out of the plan. I would argue that this regulation also falls under the same jurisdiction here for 401(a) requirements as 436 does, and that the same general restrictions kind of apply there, is that you can only pay out an amount as a single life annuity. That dollar amount, you're not paying the actual single life annuities. Their election still happens, say they elect a single lump sum, but the portion of that payment would only be limited to a single lump sum payouts. And that would also, I would argue, wouldn't be a qualification issue. So you're paying out as needed for the required distributions because that single lump sum amount, single life annuity amount is likely greater than whatever required distribution calculation that you come up here to comply there. So in other words, until those restrictions are lifted to pay out the full amount, like the employer pays a contribution so the full amount can be paid, we'll then apply those restrictions as appropriate for paying out monies in the plan to make sure you don't run afoul with those compliance issues. And you're still fine here on 401(a)(9) because you're paying out the amount not eligible for rollover. All right, moving on to the next part. We're skipping I for surviving spouses and annuity contracts because those things get complicated and most people don't deal with annuity contracts, most actuaries, for how handling the payments out of the plans or transferring the payments from annuity contracts, and they have dividends, gain losses, complexities. Those are diving there, not covering that. All right, now we're down to paragraph N for changes in annuity payments. In general, when a participant elects a form of payment, they can't change that election. It's permanent, but for a few limited situations, because pay me a life annuity, change my mind, come back 2 years later, I want a JNS now. You can't do that. Once you elect a form of payment in a DB plan, that's pretty much set in stone unless there's a few limited situations, and here we're going to talk about them. So if the employee is still employed and actually retires, then they get a new distribution packet to elect a different form of payment that would have been different than what they needed to comply, maybe different from what they need to comply with 401(a)(9). Or if the plan terminates, they get a new set of form of payments, a new set of distribution documents. If their payment was a certain only form of payments, then they can come back and elect a different form of payment. So if there's no life component on it, then they can come back and calculate it. Note that that when you're calculating a certain payment, then that amount doesn't get recalculated for a new life expectancy. The last situation is where the participant marries the beneficiary that they have a J&S form of payment with. Then they can elect a new form of payment. But that is pretty limited. Your participant is engaged with the sole beneficiary with a J&S form of payment. Yep, and then they can do a new form packet. Until then, all you have is those ones above. When re-annuitizing the new form of payments, you still need to comply with 409, 415, and 417E. If the annuity certain period was used, then you need to continue using that form of payment or that expected limitation on your certain period. You don't get to recalculate that life expectancy for that certain period. It doesn't extend beyond the original one. So we have a couple examples in the regulation here. We have example 1 where a person took a single life. When they retire, is elected to take a lump sum. You can read through that one. Example 2 is similar, but it points out you must check out the 4-3 limits at the original annuity date and along with the new annuity date. That gets a little technical, but really helpful detail reading through that one. Example 3 includes where a COLA was being used from a certain only to a life annuity. You can read through those and learn from those after the webcast. On to increasing annuity provisions. Back at the very top of the regulation, it says that your annuity payments must be non-increasing, but for these few limited exceptions here, you can actually have an increase in annuity as long as it's in one of these things in here. So we have I says that you can use a COLA as defined as one of the items below. I says you can use an eligible cost of living index as designed and described in 2 below. Double I says you can use a COLA, another one here, COLA, but as long as its cumulative impact doesn't exceed one of those indexes, a lesser value, you don't have to pin it to a cost of living index, but whatever you use must not exceed one of those indexes in 2 below. Triple I says you can use a fixed amount, not greater than 5%. Again, it has to be less than 5%, so a 4.99 is often used. And there are a few exceptions in here that it says you're fine with increases in benefits. I'm going to cover those here. If you have an increase that eliminates increases to a surviving spouse. So for example, if you had a 50% J&S, so the spouse gets 50% of what the participant gets. Well, the plan amends saying, hey, we're no longer going to offer that. We're going to true it up for everyone for free. We're going to subsidize the J&S benefits. So now your spouses will get 100% of the participants. That is fine. Increases due to amendments of the plan. So if the plan retroactively says, okay, all retirees are getting a 10% bump or additional $100, that's fine. That to me is like an additional accrual, so I'd add it in there. But if the plan adds it in retroactively, that doesn't hurt with 401(a)(9 or prospectively. Allowing a surviving spouse to elect some of all of the survivor benefits as a single lump sum, that is also fine. So if you have a participant that dies and is a 50% J&S, and instead of her taking her half portion for the rest of her life, if the plan allows for her to take her single lump sum, that is fine. That doesn't run afoul. Amounts increases for insurance contracts. I'm not going to cover that. Insurance contracts for dividends and that stuff is outside the scope of this presentation. Amounts needed to increase for suspended benefits. Late actual adjustments for benefits that were suspended that you can't suspend because you have to apply them. That makes perfect sense to me, that those increases. So for example, you had a partially vested participant, so you're applying late actual adjustments on the portion of the benefit that didn't commence. If that is your administrative interpretation of that application there, then those actual increases be fined for applying there because you couldn't use the suspension of benefits. Skipping on examples with insurance and dividends. Yep. So now we're going down to the QLACs for children. Yep. Not covering that. So now we're at the end of the -6 regulation. Let's take a quick pass on the -5 regulation with DB plans in mind. Paragraph A is similar to paragraph A of -6 for required distributions. Now we're down to paragraph B. I'm here to try to contrast the DC and DB required distributions. Paragraph B says, use the account balance as the last valuation date that was performed in the preceding calendar year. For DB plans back in -6, it specifically says DB plans use their entire benefit as of year end. While I'm interpreting here, DB plans, you do not calculate an account balance as of year end. You use their entire accrued benefit as of year end, and you use that to calculate on a specific date. So, for example, if it's 2 months out from the year end, you use the entire accrued benefit to 12/31, but you actually adjust, add interest, cash balance interest, whatever it is, to the 2 months out to be paid out as a single lump sum. Further, you don't get to use for DB plans a single lump sum account balance unless they're taking a single lump sum distribution. So keep that in mind. If they don't elect that, you don't get to use that. Down here, we actually have a spot where for DC plans, it says a plan may exclude receivables from their account balance when calculating the required distributions. But remember, you got to follow the terms of your plan document. If your document says you need to include receivables, and it's actually not uncommon to see that in there, you have to include them. You have to. So check your plan document to see what it says that you can, may, or must include receivables from account balances. For DB plans, the closest thing we have to receivables is retroactive amendments that increase benefits after the year. Are these included or excluded for required distribution calculations? Well, I don't have any clear guidance on this. However, I would argue that you can apply the same methodology here, where you may or may not include receivables, less retroactive accruals, for required distributions based on the terms of your plan document. If your plan document infers one direction, then bring them in. If it's kind of mute on that, then I'd argue you have a discretion on using the two. If you're on the conservative side, you want to interpret the retroactive amendments included, go ahead and add them in. But I would see that it'd be reasonable to point to this -5 regulation where you may exclude receivables type of accruals for your DB required distributions. Paragraph C, for one thing I'll point out, is the factors. When you're looking up a factor for calculating someone's account balance method, you use the age as of the birth date in that calendar year of the required distribution. So it's their first distribution year, likely age 73. You look up the age 73, and the second distribution year, age 74. And those are the two pieces that get calculated on their required begin date. Well, they don't both get calculated on required begin date. One is due by the required begin date, the other one is due by the end of the year, but you use the age of their year for their required distribution calculation when using the lump sum methods, single account balance methods. I'm going to skip paragraphs D, E, and F because we're focusing on when participants are alive. Now we're down to paragraph G that deals with non-vested balances. When calculating required distribution of the account balance methods for DC plans, you use the whole account balance whether or not vested. But when you pay out the required distribution amount based upon the uniform life table, you only pay out up to the vested percent of their account balance, the vested ownership amount. So you need to carry forward that non-vested portion to the next year that may get paid out the following year, depending on if a vesting increase happens there. That is not the same for DB plans. We handle those things completely differently. So that is all I'm going to cover for -5. -4 regulation, I'm not really going to cover because it has to do more with deceased participants, but has a lot of special rules in it. For example, if an estate was designated as a beneficiary, it is disregarded. Example on simultaneous deaths and what that really means. Beneficiary option to disclaim their benefit to pass it on to the next beneficiary and restarts the 5-year clock for paying out death benefits. When pertinent for you to review, you can review this later when it matters for your cases. Now down to dash 7 for rollovers and transfers. There are a couple items to note. Paragraph A indicates that you can't pass the required distribution to another plan to be paid. Each plan must pay its own required distribution. This includes if a DB plan holds a rollover, it needs to apply DC-style required distributions to that rollover account. Paragraph B says when you receive a rollover, it is the following year that you recognize the receipt of that value or the amount to be included in your required distributions. This is because in the year that you receive it from another plan, that other plan should have paid its required distribution. So you don't want to double up on the amount that needs to be paid. So you have that 1 year look back. Well, sorry, not 1 year look back. It shows up in the next year's account balance for the required distribution. And note, if you transferred the money from one plan to another at the very end of the year, such that it arrives after the year, it is deemed to have been transferred on the last day of that year, so you don't have an option to try to skip a year, a leapfrog. So IRS saw that and patched that. All right, paragraphs C, D, and E are special rules when it comes to plan-to-plan transfers and mergers. If you happen to do large plan mergers, don't forget to add a checklist item for looking at RMDs from these transferee plans. The Dash 8 regs has special rules. Again, not going into detail here, but I recommend reviewing, especially if you have a quadro on top of required distributions. The one thing I will shout out regarding the use of separate accounts for beneficiaries is that it doesn't require you to open a separate investment account for each. It just means that you need to do separate accounting and track their share of benefits and when they were paid. Time for some examples to put what we've learned into practice. We will start with a baseline example, then build from there. Example 1 is a traditional DB plan with a terminated participant who turns 73. Their applicable age, which is 2025 for the required distribution. As such, Alice's required distribution is to start April 1st, 2026. Her normal form accrued benefits at $1,000 as of 12/31/2025. And by default, assuming she's not married, then $1,000 per month would need to start as April 1st if the participant doesn't complete any paperwork. If married, then the default J&S form payment would start here. And this plan's default at 50%, which is $909.69 would need to commence at April 1st, unless election forms were completed. This plan offers many available forms, and each one of these form payments complies with 401A9. So any one of them can be selected and you start paid as their monthly benefit, and it will satisfy the required distributions of the plan. If the plan allows for different payment frequencies instead of monthly, for example, annual, then the full 12 months of payments could be paid as of April 1st or starting earlier. But once these payments commence, then they will continue for her life because she's a terminated, non-accruing participant. Our example 2 is very similar, but is a cash balance plan. Ben has an account balance of $116,000 as of 12/31/2025, and this balance as April 1st, 2026 is $116,000, which equates to $1,000 a month. I specifically chose that so it matches the first example. And when converted, it offers the same optional forms of payment as a traditional DB plan. And that is the big point here, is that cash balance plans have required distributions, the same fundamental concepts that apply as traditional plans. Once they convert their cash balance account to annuity and they begin their annuity for life, then that will continue for the rest of their life. If they didn't make election, again, $1,000 check would be paid. If not married, if married, $909 per month would begin. But again, any optional forms available under the plan that comply with 401A9 can be elected as their retirement benefit that complies with 401A9. Example 3 is where a participant takes a single lump sum of their entire benefit in the year they turn their applicable age, not the year of April 1st. Because the entire benefit is being paid during a distribution calendar year, a portion of that lump sum isn't going to be eligible for rollover. Since a single sum is being elected, we get to choose either the account balance rules or use the hypothetical annuity as if they received annuity payments from a form of payment of the plan available to them, and calculate that amount to be backed off the total amount being distributed. Her present value of accrued benefits in this case is $114,000. For the account balance method, we're going to look up from the lifetime table her divisor, which is 26.5 because she isn't married to a spouse born 10 years younger. Thus, under this account balance method, this means that of this 114,000, 4,325 isn't eligible for rollover. Under the annuity method, we get to use any form of payment of annuities available for that participant provided on the plan for calculating the 12 monthly payments that aren't eligible for rollover. It doesn't matter the timing of the single lump sum distribution during the year. If it's June or at the end of the year, you still calculate 12 hypothetical annuity payments that aren't eligible for rollover. Because you get to use any form of payment available for the participant, I put a table here to calculate each one of the optional forms, multiply it by 12, and then pick the lowest payment one, and that is a life and 20 years certain available under this plan. And that equates to $8,900 as 12-month payments. Sorry, say that $8,900 of the 12-month monthly payments that are not eligible for rollover. Between the two methods, the account balance and annuity methods, you can pick the most advantageous one, or you can do what I did here, is just use the lesser of the two methods for calculating how much is not eligible for rollover. Example 4 is where a single lump sum was elected in the year of the required begin date, April 1st. This is technically the second distribution year. As such, there'll be two RMD calculations, one for the previous year of 2025, the year that you turned her applicable age, and then 2026 for the year of the second distribution year. So the account balance style method, we're going to take the account balance of 114,000, find the uniform life table factor for her age of 73, that's 26.5. So for year 2025, 4,325 is not eligible for rollover. Then we have to add to that the 2026 RMD. So we take 114,000. This is the same account balance. In the first year, you have that special rule to use everything accrued as of the end of the year, and then thereafter you look back, and by that look back, you're going to use the same account balance for their second year distribution as you do the first year distribution. But with the second distribution year, you use their age as of that year, the second distribution year. So now we look up the factor, it's 25.5. For 4,494, that is not eligible for rollover. So add those two up, that is $8,819 that isn't eligible for rollover under the account balance method. Now for the annuity style method, same idea as we did previously, but instead of 12 months of RMD payments, we're going to have 24, so 12 months for each year that they were past the required applicable age. Again, the same method is where you use any available optional form available to the participant for calculating the hypothetical annuity amounts for the full years for the begin year, 2025 and 2026 for the amounts not eligible for rollover. Here, this is going to be $70,800 that isn't eligible as annuity payments. So I'm doing the same things before. I'm using the lesser of the two, the account balance method or annuity payments. So that means 105,000 is eligible for rollover, and that 8,800 isn't eligible for rollover. Example 5 is showing the vesting impact for a 5% owner. Emma, who turned 73 in 2025 adopted a new cash balance plan. She's a 5% owner. There's a 3-year vesting cliff that excludes service before the effective date. And the plan has a 5-year participation requirement for the retirement age. This is all to have vesting not kick in as far back as it can to avoid having required distributions. So let's take a look at this plan. And this can be a traditional cash balance plan. The same concepts apply. So as the end of 12/31/2025, Emma has $1,000, 0% vesting. So the vested monthly benefit at the end of the year is 0. Therefore, the required distribution payments to be made by April 1st are 0. And also, the second distribution year for 2026 is also going to be 0. Because remember, you have kind of have 2 years if you were taking a lump sum, but it doesn't really matter. Or your annuities you can commence by April 1st. Yep, it doesn't really matter because there was 0, 0 either way for your April 1st begin date. During 2026, he accrues another layer of benefit, but it again is 0% vested. So the required distributions for 2027, since you look back at the end of the calendar year preceding for their vesting and accrued benefit, since that's 0, then there is no RMD to be paid during 2027. Now, moving forward to the next year, the 12/31/2027 end of year benefit, she became vested sometime during 27. So at the end of 27, she has a vested accrued benefit. Therefore, there's going to be an RMD to commence 2028. Now, very likely, this is going to commence January as a monthly benefit, January 2028, and be paid monthly thereafter. So anticipate that you're going to have to do some election forms so that she can do an election of other form of payment. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck with a default form of payment for paying out those benefits. That's a gray area whether or not you can elect after the fact. I'm not going to address that today. But the point is, you're looking back as the end of the calendar year preceding for how much you're going to pay for your current RMD year. And assuming this person doesn't accrue any additional benefits, 2029 and 2030 will all have the same required annuity payments out of the plan because this is a life annuity. Generally, not increasing, decreasing unless you have a COLA input. But yes, the required distribution payments would be at least this amount for going years forward until either she retires or the plan terminates. And again, any optional form available to her could be used that complies with 401(a)(9), including taking a lump sum distribution and applying those other methods. You would look back at the vesting amount for how much is not eligible for rollover. Example 6 is our final example. There are a few key points in this example. Again, we have a new plan that excludes vesting service before the effective date of the plan and has a 5-year participation requirement. Suspension of benefits notice was provided to our participant David here to avoid late actual adjustment complications. Each year, David earns $168,000 cash balance contribution credit. Until he is not vested until 2027. As such, there are no required distributions until 2028, and those required distributions are to commence 1/1/28. Now, what is the benefit to be paid? Look at the cash balance account at 12/31/2027. That gets converted into a monthly benefit, and from there, any optional forms that comply with 401(a)(9) can be used for their required distribution payments. I'm using the normal form here for simplicity. Just keep that in mind. They can elect any other optional form of payment. Now, looking into how much of this cash balance account is used. So when you look at the cash balance account, when they annuitize, their annuity benefit generally gets bifurcated from their cash balance account, separated out. So as of 12/31/2027, $529,000 was converted to a single life annuity, the normal form of this plan, of $4,084 to be paid for the remainder of his life. This $4,084 is converted to $57,643 as annual taxation payments but this amount is not deducted from the cash balance account. It was the $529,000 that gets the cash balance account is converted to for that benefit to be paid. This is generally because annuity payments are not lump sum. Cash balance accounts are for the lump sum options, so you wouldn't deduct annuity payments directly on the cash balance account because it creates a complication of complexity, possibly anti-cutback issue. Moving on, the next year, the individual gets $168,000 cash balance contribution credit. As at the end of the year, that gets converted to a life annuity of $1,586. That gets added on to the existing $4,800 for a total of $6,390 of a monthly benefit starting the first day of 2029. Again, the next year, another layer happens again. So another year of a contribution credit, and that gets converted at the end of the year, and that gets added for a total amount of $8,046. So each year you get a layer that gets converted and added to it. And these things don't decrease or get recalculated every year for how much required distribution is done. These are life annuities. Notice here in that year 2030 or 2031, this individual did not accrue additional cash balance contribution credits. So we have the same $8,046 being paid per month until his life or retires or terminates the plan. Those keep on going to be paid. In this illustration, for the table here, I have two columns. We have two columns for distributions. One for the lump sum distributions and another for annuity conversions or annuity purchases. This is a convenience factor to help illustrate how benefits get calculated and paid out a cash balance plan to keep the fundamental point of pension plans in that the same rules apply to your traditional and cash balance plans, is that these are life annuities to be paid. Well, life annuities, the individual could have each year elected to take a lump sum distribution of his entire cash balance account, single lump sum, and then deploy those either methods of the account bound method or the 12 months annuity payment we discussed earlier and get those entirely paid out. Well, sorry, a portion of that gets rolled, majority of it gets rolled, and a smaller portion of that does not get rolled and paid to the individual. You just assume the full 12 months of hypothetical payments. Either way, you still have the same idea, is that a traditional plan and a cash balance plan have the same general rules for how they operate. And if you start deducting annuity payments on the cash balance account, then that potentially causes a double reduction, which would be a cutback issue. So that's why it's very helpful to illustrate cash balance accounts with two columns for how to subtract their benefits from there. So amounts taken as a single sum, and then amounts that were used to convert to an annuity benefits. And that really helps keep everything consistent. And it's even though your plan document might not call it that way for how payments are being paid out, but again, it helps everything be consistent for how benefits are to be paid as life annuities from a pension plan / cash balance plan. On to the additional resources. There are not too many publications out there by the IRS providing additional guidance on required distributions for pension plans. Listed here a few notices if you wanted to load them up and review them, but they didn't really add more context to this presentation. Moving down to the distribution elections and the notices generally to be included. When you're doing a RMD calculation packet for participants, don't forget the notice for what's not eligible to be rolled over and what is. You still have to do the spousal consent, form of payments for optional form of payments that aren't the default J&S. For the withholdings, there are two withholding forms. You have W4P and W4R, one for the pension annuity payments and the other for the lump sum. If you're not sure which form of payment they are, well, then the fail-safe is to provide both with instructions telling them to fill out which for their withholding amounts. And then as for their withholding amounts, so if they elect a annuity, there is an annual 3405 withholding notice as required by IRC 3405 that the individual be notified that they have the annual option to change their withholding amount on their pension payments. Well, not required to be a notice, the top 25 HCE restricted 110% restriction and IRC 436, less than 80% accelerated distribution restrictions. I've actually seen court cases where the HCE has sued because the plan was refusing to pay him his entire benefit. And there was more legal fees in one of those court cases than there was actual the issue being the amount being paid out. If a notice was provided up front explaining that yes, you can still elect a lump sum amount, but we can't pay it until the restrictions have lifted. We can pay you X amount, the single life annuity per month annually. That would have helped mitigate those chances for lawsuits. All right, moving down to the reporting section, 1099Rs for reporting distributions. Not really going to dive into those details. Recommend looking at the 1099 instructions for how to code a 1099R for how things get reported as taxed or rollover available. IRC 4974 says there'll be a 25% tax on required distributions if not paid by the time 401A requires. This was a change by Secure recently. Instead of 50%, now it's 25%. And this amount is further reduced if fixed by the plan before the IRS provides the notice, and is also fixed by the second taxable year and after the missed required distribution. As with any code section, it's best to go to look at any regulation to see how to apply code for the rules the Treasury IRS had published. 54.4974-1 is basically a brand new regulation. Before, there was -2 for qualified retirement plans, but -1 and -2 regs were combined, effective for years starting 2025. The key point here is that A3 says that besides the first distribution year, keep a pin in that for a later discussion, taxes are based on calendar year ends for the amounts that weren't paid. So as long as you true up by year end, besides the first distribution year, then you don't have any excise taxes due for the year. This is consistent with administratively feasible provision to square up your plans by new year end for any new accruals. Again, that's new accruals, so your initial accrual isn't considered in that option. So you have a first year special provision we'll talk about in a split second here. So for a defined benefit plan, because KEEP 4974 is for all plans, DC and DB, a key point here is for defined benefit plan, if they elected a annuity option for required distribution, but the plan failed to implement that election, then taxes are based upon their elected form of payment for the excise tax of what should have been. So if they missed a couple years of payments, the participant just said whatever, well, then you use that elected form of payments, multiply it by what was supposed to be paid, and then get that taxes paid. However, if their elected form of payment doesn't comply with 41A9, then you would take the most expensive available form of payment to the participant to calculate the excise taxes. So since there was no single lump sum paid, you're going to default to annuity form of payments. And we have the scenario of the single participant or the married participant. And we're likely going to use one of those two form of payments to calculate how much taxes were due for those missed required payments and calculate the excise tax. Again, this is my best interpretation of the guidance, is that it is, since there is no elected form of payment, by the participant the default form of payment, the most expensive, very likely is going to be. So it's going to be a single life multiplied by 12 for how many years that was missed, or the joint survivor multiplied by 12 for how many years that were missed. 12 monthly payments times, to say 2 years missed, added up for the total excise tax that was to be paid. One can make the argument that the single life annuity payment applies for both scenarios, the married and unmarried. Reasonable guidance here, reasonable interpretations. Let me see. Let me keep going on here. So if for payments, if there was no election to be paid for their first year, so let's zero in on this first year issue, because above is talking about besides the first year for your required distribution payments, then this is how you proceed with it. When you look in deeper, it doesn't talk about, for specifically defined benefit plans, how to handle your applicable age year, the payments that are begin by April 1st, how to calculate the excise taxes on those years, that specific year. So in April 1st, you were supposed to begin your annuity payments for the rest of the year. So you have 9 months, say $1,000 in our examples above, that should have been paid. Well, what is the excise tax on that first year required distribution? I didn't see it in this reg. I looked for the IRS audit manual, private letter rulings, and court cases to try to find any precedents for how these gets calculated, and I wasn't able to find any definitive guidance. One could make an argument that these excise taxes for the first distribution year, as long as you pay a true up by year end, then you don't have to pay excise taxes, because at the very beginning of this 4974 reg, it says you calculate a calendar year basis, but it does say besides the first year. So, well, you were supposed to pay annuity payments as of April 1st, and you didn't. Let's say you're 3 months late. You missed 3 payments. You had a clear deadline. You plan didn't pay it. So to me, that's obviously taxes are due. How much of that is due? I would argue that the missed payments were the amount that need to have the excise tax paid. So if you self-correct, you have 10% of those 3 payments, 3 monthly payments, and then begin your annuity. So the penalties are relatively benign for the year of your excise taxes, because it's just say $1,000 a month, so 3,000 times 10, so you have $300 in excise tax due for that late start of the benefits. I could see counter arguments that the whole year could be made, but I don't think that's really reasonable, because if you look at a situation where a participant did commence on time, and then just compare it to a participant that didn't commence on time, and the 3 months difference, those are the only months that were missed, or were late. So to me, that makes it pretty clear that the 4974 excise taxes apply just to the months that were late. If we go down to EPCRS for correction procedures, for trying to infer what the excise tax calculation would be missed or would be paid, and EPCRS does talk about the missed payments. What should have been done? You add those up and get them paid to the participant with actual interest for their late payment, to compensate them for the late payments and get them caught up. And so EPCRS specifically calls out, well, there's missed payments, and so that's where I would apply the 4974 excise tax amount on just those amounts that were missed. And then going forward, since those are made on timely, then wouldn't worry about those things for calculating on the excise tax. I wouldn't also include the actual interest for the excise tax. That is a compensation to the participant, but 4189 requires the monthly amounts to be paid. It doesn't talk about the late actual interest being required for 4189. At least that is what I saw for interpreting the code and regulation. Since there's a lack of guidance, and if you have sponsors that are in this boat where they've missed paying their required distributions, feel free to explain this gray area to sponsors and allow them to make the interpretation that they want to. If they want to say their whole year, since they didn't commence for the whole year for their applicable age year, they're going to take the 12 months multiplied by 12 for the applicable age year, kind of like a hypothetical annuity distribution, and calculate that. That's, I think, overkill for calculating the excise tax. But until we get additional guidance from the commissioner or a court case providing details there, then yeah, I say just calculate it on the monthly payments that were missed. If you or anyone of your teams have encountered this scenario before, please feel free to share it, and I'll amend this recording to share what your experiences were for missed required distributions, excise tax payments from a DB plan where annuity payments were made. If a lump sum was elected and failed to be paid, well, then you kind of have to use that route for calculating the excise tax. But that's unlikely the scenario, but possible that payments or form was received so late that you were unable to pay it in time. And then calculate the excise tax on the elected form of payment, aka the lump sum, and then apply that 10% because you're correcting it, calculation for how much needs to be paid to the excise taxes. Excise taxes are reported on the Form 5329, and that is an individual form, not a plan form. It is also it is possible to request a waiver of this excise tax, and that can be done through VCP. There's a special checkbox on the form. You got to check for that, or the Form 14568H. For electing a waiver on the misrequired distributions from the IRS. And there has to be some reasonable reason why you weren't able to pay your required distribution for that individual, and it needs to be something reasonable, not just you forgot about it. Note that there are two issues required around misrequired distributions. You have the excise tax on the participant, and you have the disqualification of the plan. So there are two separate issues. The plan must pay its RMDs, and the participant must pay the excise tax. For the qualification issue, the plan can generally self-correct if it is an insignificant issue, or if it is classified as a significant one, you can submit via the VCP to correct that qualification defect. For more information, you may follow these links for self-corrections. I found a couple private letter rulings regarding 401A9 and 4974. Yes, I constantly hear you can't use private letter rulings. They're specific for the facts and circumstances of that case. But if you look into the private letter rulings, it specifically cites the guidance as applicable. You too, if that guidance is applicable for your facts and circumstances of your case, you can cite that same logic and process for how it applies to your plan. So you don't cite the PLR, the private letter ruling. You cite the applicable guidance in how to argue your plan is in compliance with these specific facts and circumstances. For these PLRs, for 489 and 4974, none of them were really material for modifying or expanding how to apply these, the 4975 operations. How do you calculate them? How do you process them? None of these PLRs added more to the context. The one court case that I found with regards to 4189/4974 and related to defined benefit plans is this court case here. And again, this is specific to defined benefit. I was trying to hunt in on that topic to get a little more guidance on any gray area. But this court case, the only gray area that it provided was that the judge argued the statute of limitations clock began to tick once the Form 5329 was filed. And since there was no Form 5329 ever filed for this case, it left an indefinite open window for when the IRS could come and provide penalties on very old issues, Congress didn't agree with that, so they amended the IRC 6501 to provide a 6-year limitations for when they file their personal taxes, not with the Form 5329. This isn't something typically that plan administrators would deal with. This is more along the lines of the attorney helping with a defined benefit plan, it doesn't matter which defined benefit plan, an qualified retirement plan, where they've missed many years of required distributions. And so there's a statute of limitation question about what can be brought in for penalties. So this is helpful for attorneys that are diving into these really ugly plans, for helping provide consulting guidance on how to move forward on their egregious misrequired distributions. For everyone else, it's VCP, get your plan cleaned up, pay your excise tax to make sure your plan is in compliance. On to valuation considerations when required distributions are considered. For the Schedule SB, it has a signature line, and above that signature line it says, in my opinion, each assumption is reasonable, taking into account the experience of the plan and reasonable expectations. And with other assumptions, a combination is my best estimate of the anticipated experience of the plan. So that kind of sets a general tone of what to value for benefits of the plan. When it comes to required distributions, for example, owner-only plans, you're not really sure what their benefit is going to be paid out truly from the plan. Let me get to that in a moment. So when you have a retired participant that is no longer accruing benefits and it's a larger plan, they've elected the form of payment, and those elections generally cannot change unless the plan terminates. So it makes perfect sense to value that elected form of payment for the remainder of the life of how much is going to be paid from the plan. Now back to an active employee who's taking required distributions. Their form of payment can change. If they elected a certain only payment, then that can change. If they retire, then they get another option to change their benefit payments. And likely, if it's owner-only plan, they'll take a single lump sum distribution. And if someone's 75, 80, the imminent timing of when they're going to terminate and shut down their business or retire can be any moment. It could be next year. So from my personal experience, I really haven't had a required distribution plan have it on long-term required distribution payments. A couple of years of payments happen, and then the plan typically pays out a single lump sum because the owner retires. And then incidentally, the plan terminates. You can't anticipate the termination of the plan, but you can anticipate the termination of the owner for getting their benefit paid out as a single lump sum. So with all that in mind, one more thing. I've also had situations where the spouse refuses to turn in the spousal consent form. So we couldn't pay out anything but the default form of payment from the plan until the plan shut down. Then we had another conversation. But that also made another complexity of what to anticipate for how the plan gets payout benefits. But ultimately, most my small plans almost always pay a single lump sum one day or another. So looking at RMDs for pension plans, is it reasonable to assume their elected form of payment while an active participant is going to continue for the rest of their life? One could argue, no, that's not reasonable, because have you ever seen that happen? But it is reasonable because without any more guidance from the participant that they are going to terminate, it's a reasonable assumption that those are going to continue. For how many years? 3, 5, 10? It's hard to tell. Typically, this valuation software doesn't allow you the option to split the portion of time you might expect for required distribution annuity payments versus the final ultimate lump sum payment. So you generally have a choice to make in valuation software, as you're going to assume the RMD elected form of payments are going to continue, or the entire benefit is going to be paid out as a lump sum. And I don't see that is done as often as much, but to me that makes a lot of sense to assume the entire benefit of the plan for the individual is going to be paid out as a lump sum after 1 year after the valuation date. But the benefits of their RMD payments are not ignored. They are just considered to be paid in a form of payment as a lump sum in the near future. So the plan's payments out of there doesn't necessarily have to match your best anticipated experience of the plan for facts and circumstances of your case. Often I see like 3 scenarios for required distributions being paid out of plans. It is that the actuary is showing the annuity elective form payments for RMD, or the actuary is just assuming all the benefit is being paid as a lump sum, or the advance option where the new accruals are assumed to be paid out as a lump sum, and in the existing accrued benefit that has a form of payment attached to it, then that gets the annuity payments. So you're kind of splitting out the two, but the total benefits between the two records, should I say, accounts for the participant's entire benefit to be paid as a lump sum once that individual decides to retire. Each case is a little different, and the timing is such. If you want to assume day after valuation date, is that reasonable, unreasonable? That's up to the actuary to determine. 1 year out, 2 years out. That depends on the facts and circumstances of your case to determine what is reasonable to reflect in the valuation results. And that's all I'm going to shout out regarding the valuation considerations for required distributions. If you have any other feedback, tips, or ideas, feel free to share. I'll consider amending this section of the recording to add more suggestions and considerations for your valuation purposes. The last section here on the website that I have is an RMD distribution checklist. It's not a comprehensive checklist, but it is kind of an overall structure or shell to consider when you are preparing your own required distribution checklist of steps to consider, to look through of what might be needed for your plan. For example, do you have a set date to send out your 3305 withholding election forms to anyone that's already in pay status, subject to required distributions, and therefore they can consider changing the withholding elections? So those type of little details are helpful to work into, or updating 8955s because they decided to take a lump sum now, and the person previously was a terminated employee that hasn't started, so now they're commencing their benefits, so the 8955 needs to be updated. Again, feedback is requested, and I'll consider updating what's contained here on the website that may be helpful for you and your administration practices. Previously, I mentioned that annuity payments are not eligible for rollover. That would not be the first time I've had to point this out. In IRC 402C4, it says distributions eligible for rollover are any distribution from a qualified retirement plan other than payments that are substantially equal, made for the life of the employee or joint lives with the beneficiary, a certain annuity of 10 or more years, hardship, and for our purposes, any distribution under 401A9 required distributions. This is clear. Annuity payments from defined benefit plans are not eligible for rollover, period. Going into regulation 1.402C2, paragraph B, it provides some supporting details. Paragraph F1 adds when distributions are paid, you first have to satisfy required distributions for the year. Then you can consider rollovers. So when you're paying out the checks to the participants, you first do the RMD payment to them personally as ordinary income, and then you do the rollover to another retirement plan or IRA. Further, it says if a required distribution was missed, the amount needed gets carried forward to following years to be paid first before any rollovers can happen. This makes sense as part of correction procedures. If you are owed required distributions, you got to get those squared up. Paragraph 2, F2, reinforces that if you do a distribution before they turn their applicable age, their first distribution year, then distributions may be eligible for rollover. Back to my point that I made previously, that if you do not want to calculate required distribution from a defined benefit plan where a participant elected a single lump sum, then get that completed before the year they turn their applicable age. So probably 72, get that in that year, not the year they turn 73. Down towards the bottom of this regulation, we have paragraph K for other rules. In K2, the actual required distribution amount calculation is used for what is eligible for rollover, not what the plan administrator assumed to calculate to get the required distribution done. In this paragraph, it describes where the plan administrator used a uniform life table to complete the required distribution, but it turns out the participant was married to a spouse 10 years younger, so they should have used the other table instead of uniform life table, so that excess that was paid to the individual because the plan administrator's assumption can be rolled over to an IRA. In other words, if you do not have all the pieces of information available to process a required distribution, do not let that hold up your required distributions. Get those paid because those are plan qualification requirements. If after getting all the needed factors for how much need to get paid, and there happen to be an excess, well, then you can just notify the participant that, hey, this amount actually is eligible, more was taken out, moving on. If there happens to be a shortfall, which would be very rare, as I would expect, maybe a joint and survivor annuity payments where the spouse's birth date was significantly different, then you'd be into the minor realm of self-correction with a little true-up instead of a misrequired distribution. Because technically, arguably, the required distributions have commenced. But I'll let you worry about that in the facts and circumstances of your particular case. Let's recap what we covered here by going up to the key points at the top of this webpage for important details that we covered. So the required begin date is the April 1st after they turn their applicable age, or if they retire if they're a non-5% owner. And this April 1st is the year, technically the year after their first distribution year. So as a defined term as their first distribution year. So that has a required distribution be done. It just must be paid by April 1st of the year following, just that first year. All other years after the first distribution year, it is to be done by the calendar year end of that year. Just like in DC plans, for the first distribution year, paid during the second year, you have 2 RMD payments for the account balance single lump sum methods. That is generally more or less true for defined benefit plans, but with annuity payments, you just have to commence your benefits at that time. For a 5% owner, it is their ownership as of April 1st using the code 416, so family members will also be classified as a 5% owner. And as April 1st, if they are, even if they sell their ownership afterwards, they continue to be a 5% owner and must continue taking the required distribution payments. Actual increases are required for non-5% owners starting on their April 1st following the year they turn 70.5. So it is a separate required begin date, and that will cease to apply once they commence their benefits. As for 5% owners, I didn't really emphasize it much during the webcast, but suspension of benefits notices can be provided to them to minimize the complexities of late actual adjustment calculations. For example, if you're a traditional DB plan using a 6-year graded vesting schedule where they get 20% per year, and you're applying late actual adjustments on the portion of benefit that didn't commence, well, then that calculation can be very cumbersome. And providing a suspension of benefits to stop those late actual adjustments for the 5% owner, that might be worth your and the plan sponsor's time for how much time it's going to take to calculate those late actual adjustments and bifurcating all those little pieces. Very helpful tool. Suspension benefit notices for 5% owners when you don't want to apply late actual adjustments. Check your document to confirm that you can do that. If gray, use a reasonable interpretation provision of your plan document to determine whether or not that can be used or not. By default, defined benefit plans need to commence their annuity benefit payments by the required begin date. So typically, it's a monthly annuity starting April 1st, after the year following, and it just simply continues thereafter. In general, any form of payment that complies with 419 elected by the participants can be used. As long as that form of payment complies, but most plan documents, these days don't have optional forms that are outlandish, so it's pretty simple to stay in compliance. With a single lump sum method, you have the two methods to comply. You can use a DC method, where you use the lifetime table, or you can treat as if the annuity payments, any form of payment available for the participant for that entire distribution year, just multiply that by 12 with monthly accruals, and that amount will be treated as a required distribution not to be paid, or the account balance. So you can use lesser of two. It gives you the option to specify. It gives you discretion to choose the most advantageous one, unless for some reason your plan document specified that it need to use a specific form. And in such a case, you need to comply with that, whatever calculation method is prescribed. Otherwise, the excise tax will be calculated based upon the terms of the plan, not necessarily the method used. Shout out back to the DC method for paying out from DC plans. It does allow you to exclude, in the regulation, receivables from a DC account balance when you're calculating RMD. But if the plan document doesn't allow that, then you can't do that. And your excise tax would be considered on the amount that should have been paid per the terms of plan, not necessarily the amount that the reg allows. So again, follow the terms of your plan documents. Separate components, each identifiable component of the plan. So an accrual, for example, that is calculated for years, that can have a different election applied to it. You can bifurcate, split up your required distributions to mix and match calculations. Just be sure to help document which piece was applied with what and how you're able to separately calculate them. In DB plans, vesting increases and additional accruals apply generally to the year following, not like DC plans. And any additional accruals for administrative delays, just square those up by the calendar year end. And the excise tax calculation also supports that, as long as you true up your, for not your first years, because those are the special rules, but any year after your first year, just make sure your calendar year ends have the required distribution payments done on time for the calendar year end. So it switches like the DC plan schedule. Just note, if you did your April 1st annual payments, those generally still need to be done April 1st every year after. So it's trued up by year end because you're satisfying everything by April. Just make sure that any additional accruals, you let your plan sponsor know that you're probably going to be higher next year. If it's fixed formula, that's very helpful. 436 restrictions. Don't hold up your distributions for 436 of the high 25. You just have to limit how much gets paid to a single life annuity. Didn't dive into those details, but if there are questions, feel free to send me a comment or question via email. And in general, you can't really change your form of payment unless you have a few exceptions that applies. For example, the participant actually retires, plan terminates. Those are the two big ones. There are a couple little other ones. As for withholding amounts, there's two different withholding forms to consider using or to modeling after if you're using your own custom forms, the W4P and W4R. And don't forget about your 340, what was that thing called again? That annual withholding election form to be provided out to participants. So if they want to change their withholding amount from year to year, they have that option because that is a requirement. And lastly, the shout out to the valuation considerations. People get a little too worked up on the assumed form of payments for the valuations, and they get really particular. They must follow the elected form on the paper. On the side of the fence where that you are valuing the anticipated experiences of the plan. And that may or may not be those annuity payments elected by the participant, because there might be an option for them to retire and take a lump sum. And that is another reasonable assumption to consider. All right, well, that does it for the webcast today. Feel free to submit any questions, comments, or clarifications, and I will consider updating this webcast with additional details.